Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm your host for today's session on the latest research on identity tampering and how you can mitigate it. My name is Crean and I'm Commercial Vice President at Windward. I'm based here in London in the UK. Being a maritime AI company gives us the opportunity to become a trusted advisor and not just a vendor. And in order to deliver on that, it's all about the people. So I've got two great colleagues joining me today. So I've got my colleague, Chloe Deacon. So Chloe, can you tell us a bit about your background, your role, and how you approach what we do with customers?
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Chloe Deacon. I'm a solutions expert at Windward, and I've been with Windward for the last 5 months. I come from the world of CDD, so I bring over 15 years of experience in CDD and banking, wealth management, and in the last 10 years, I've worked in energy and shipping with BP. So obviously, I bring all of that CDD expertise with me. I've worked on processes, IT solutions, so I can help not only develop the product, but as well as really understand our clients' needs.
Excellent. Great, thanks, Chloe. And the other pro to know today is Dror Salzman. So Dror, can you introduce yourself and give us an idea of the kind of topics we're going to cover today?
Sure thing. Thanks, Ron. Pleasure to be here. My name is Dror. I'm the Intelligence Research Manager here at Windward. And for the past 3 years, I've been working with both commercial and governmental clients on different types of maritime typologies, assisting the UN panel of experts on DPRK, amongst others. And today we're going to take another step yet in this fascinating journey of deceptive shipping practices. We're going to review a little bit about what's been happening so far and introduce a new typology that we've recently discovered and that is affecting, I would say, the exposure to commercial risk.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Thanks, Dror. So let's go through some logistics for today. So we'll get into the main topic shortly, but in the meantime, I'll just ask a quick poll question to get us started. So if we get the poll question up there on the screen, and I'll give you a while to give that some thought. So you saw last year we had another advisory from OFAC. It was the 4th in 18 months, and we talked about it a few times already. So you hopefully be mostly familiar with it, but we're interested in your thoughts in terms of where are you in that process and how much of you embrace that, if at all. So I'll leave the question there. We'll come back to the actual answers on it shortly. So let's get into it. So have you ever driven your car, you're relying on your sat nav, and then you realize that it's 50 meters out when it tells you to make a turn? We rely on these systems every day, and systems like GPS in the USA, Galileo in Europe, GLONASS and others, and they're all super accurate, and even have other layers of accuracy on them with things like EGNOS in Europe. We rely on these things to be accurate without having to really think about them. And similar to the car example, we're now seeing something emerging that makes positional accuracy appear to be systematically and deliberately different. And that's the subject of today's briefing. So we're really talking about the spoofing of the global navigation satellite system on vessels. So if you haven't come across it, it's essentially the manipulation of positioning and timing data to global navigation system receivers. Now, in normal times, we'd expect from GNSS accuracy and integrity and continuity and availability. So they're the minimum. That's what you'd expect without having to think about it. So today, what we're going to really look at is the impact of the right insight at the right time to the people who need it most. So it's a big subject. So you've got to isolate it down to something that makes sense. So to isolate this issue down and build some context around it, we're going to focus on a certain size of vessel today, which Dror is going to take us through. So I know a lot of you have probably been to lots of our webinars over the last couple of years, and it's great to see you back again if you're returning. So you may be already aware of what we describe as emerging typologies, but for those of you who are less clear on it, what we really mean, and this will become clearer as Dror draws it out, is the emergence in new patterns of behavior that might be repeated elsewhere. So because we've got an AI system, essentially it will flag these things, and it'll teach itself to look out for new patterns of behavior. And then our analyst team, led by Dror, get to review them. And the way we do that is by adopting an approach called vertical AI. And that's really where we put together deep domain expertise in maritime, along with data scientists. And what I think is unusual and interesting about this mix is it's not just about the technology, it's also about psychology and behavior. And we've actually got behavioral PhDs on the staff as well. So it's quite an interesting approach to an old problem, which is becoming more and more difficult as time goes on. So let's look at the journey we're on. So when we think about from static to dynamic approach to risk, most of the customers that we speak to, they're using some form of what we describe as list matching. You know, is this thing on a list, yes or no? And that could be, you know, ships, or it could be companies. You know, so we're looking at all of those things and trying to help build better context faster around those things. So as a minimum, you'd want to know what the link is between the vessel and the ownership, and whether it's already on a known sanctions list. And you'd also want to know its history. You know, these are the minimum. We describe this as table stakes. You know, this is the minimum that you need to know. But what's really evolved, particularly in the last 3 years, is the dynamic approach to risk and being able to tailor your risk approach according to your own company risk appetite. But Dror's going to pick up on these practices and how they've changed over time. So I'm just going to pause there and pull up the poll answers. We could do that. That's great. Interesting. Okay, fantastic. So if I could just ask Chloe, what do you think of that distribution, Chloe, from your perspective?
Yeah, and it makes sense. I mean, we've seen these deceptive shipping practices evolving over the last 3 years. You know, there's a constant increase in requirements of CDD teams, and it's a journey, obviously, you know, to implement these new requirements.
Yeah.
So it all makes sense. I can see that, you know, some people are, you know, have a dynamic approach. Some people are still, you know, working through it.
Yeah. Interesting. And Dror, is that what you'd expect from your perspective?
I think we're still evaluating is probably what everyone in the maritime domain is currently doing, right? I think that the OFAC 2020 advisory kind of kicked off this situation in which everyone needs to just reassess the way they do due diligence, and monitoring systems such as our own need to reassess how they actually find these emerging typologies.
Yeah, sure. So when you think about those emerging typologies, I think over the last few years, we know that, you know, deceptive shipping practices have evolved. So why don't you take us through that evolution?
Sure thing. Okay, so if any one of our attendees has already been to one of our webinars, you might know this slide from before. And actually what this slide, I want to tell you about it, is that we have seen for the past, I would say almost 8 years, the evolution of deceptive shipping practices and the way they are just becoming more and more sophisticated. So back in 2014, we were talking about vessels simply changing their flag, thinking that would be enough to disguise their identity. We saw that with the entire Iranian tanker fleet actually changing to the flags of Tanzania and other African nations. And then in 2016, I think the sophistication kind of took a step up, and we saw the beginning of what is dark activity, right? That is, you spoke about the reliance on global navigation systems. So what happens when the global navigation system just goes off, right? A vessel disappears for a long period of time, you can't account for where it is. And that made its way into not only the advisories that we see now that have to do with compliance, but also into insurance clauses and much more, since AIS, as we know, and global navigation systems are also safety measures and not just location indicators. And then we saw, I would say, the most sophisticated typology yet, which was the usage of another vessel's identity, which is broadly named spoofing. I know that this is kind of a vague term nowadays, but yes, assuming the identity of another vessel, whether it is a scrapped vessel or a vessel of the same size operating in the same area. We saw that happening a lot in the area of DPRK and also in the Persian Gulf. Last year, we saw the usage of multiple flags, which we saw also in the advisory, defined as flag hopping, right? The usage of multiple flags over a short duration. And I think that the past, as someone that has been investigating these type of typologies for a few years now, I could say that the past 8 months to a year have been the greatest leap we've seen so far. And it's become really, really prominent in how the digitalization of the maritime domain is affecting all aspects, which include also illicit actors, right? So we know that there are new technologies to monitor vessels, where there are new technologies to make them disappear as well. And one of the ones that we've seen most recently is that instead of hopping between flags, we see a lot of vessels that are systematically abusing certain flags, which in many cases are not even aware that they are being abused. So we know that for a vessel to register with a certain flag, there is some sort of a commercial process. And we know that many vessels are skipping this commercial process and just simply transmit an MMSI number, which the prefix is the one that defines the flag that is being used. Another one is, if you've had the chance to read our recent publications or participate in one of our recent webinars, is the usage of location tampering. So that reliability of the GNS location, I would say, systems is no longer there. I mean, the illusion of knowledge is the era in which we live in today and operate in today. So the location of a vessel is no longer trustworthy to a full extent, and the right tools are needed to be able to identify if a vessel is manipulating its global navigation system. And the topic of today is actually something relatively new, which is called, well, I would say it's the evolution or the comeback of dark activity. From what we knew, dark activity was used for anything from security issues to also sanction evasions. And I think that now the deep dark activity that we're going to review today is actually the evolution of this typology, because it is being used in a kind of a different way. We've never seen these type of durations for dark activity, especially not deliberate ones. And I think that what we're going to see today is going to surprise the participants. But before we get started on the topic of the day, I want to show you a little bit more about the other two typologies that are mentioned here in 2021. And let's start with the systematic flag manipulation. So one sec. Great. So what you can see here is a graph, right? And this graph is pretty simple. We're talking about new vessels that joined the Cameroon flag fleet over a period of time of 3 years, right? So looking at 2018, only 14 vessels registered with the flag of Cameroon. So these are newcomers, right? Some vessels left, other vessels remained, and these are actually newcomers. And then in 2019, that number rose to 60, okay? So 60 new vessels registered with the flag of Cameroon. That is, I don't know, if that was amount of friends, I would say the flag Cameroon is becoming very popular in high school. And then in 2020, we saw that rise even more, and this time it was 75 new vessels joining the flag of Cameroon. And when I say joining, I mean start transmitting. And the difference between transmitting and registering is that the official process would be to register with the flag registry. And in this case, we saw that vessels are simply starting to transmit that flag without necessarily registering with the flag registry. So in 3 years, the flag of Cameroon had made a 435% jump in the amount of transmitting vessels. And I think that that is very interesting. But then again, context is key, and we're gonna mention that down the line about the typology that we're going to discuss today. But if you look at the class division in 2020, you'll see that out of the 75 vessels that joined in 2020, 27 of those were actually crude oil tankers. Now, when you're talking about the maritime domain, crude oil tankers have one function, and that is to move crude oil across the world. And the usage of the combination of a flag of convenience, such as this one, with the crude oil fleet that joined this this flag, was actually something that led us to investigate this even further. And we saw that all of these tankers had some sort of risk indicators, whether it be behavioral, that match with one of the typologies that we've been investigating recently. And we see that there is correlation between the abuse of the Cameroon flag fleet and sanctions evasions in general. The second thing that we see a lot in the second typology that I want to show you is the location or global navigation tampering, which you can read about on our website, but I'm just going to touch this really shortly. And that is, as you can see on the left side, you can see the manipulation of location in a vessel that actually conducts a slow speed activity in a perfect symmetrical circle. Now, that is just behaviorally impossible in the maritime domain. And that is something that you would need some sort of maritime expertise to actually be able to see. Now, we don't expect the entire maritime domain or shipping industry to be able to notice that, but I think that when this is becoming so popular, and we're talking about over 100 cases already that have been identified and confirmed, and when this is orchestrated, as you can see on the right side of the screen, with vessels copying each other's paths, I think that it's just crucial to have the ability to identify that risk when it's happening, right? So you don't need to know how it's being done as much as you need to know that it is being done, right? Or when and if the vessel, which vessels were involved. And I think that that is one of the turning points that we had in terms of deceptive shipping practices, as this was a military grade technology now in the use of commercial entities. And I think this is a very big game changer. That leads us to the topic of today, and I want to start it off with a question. So we're going to use our polling system again. And what you can see here are two vessels. Both of them have done a dark activity period of 2 months. You can see on the right-hand side, one did it between the Indian Ocean and I would say the Mediterranean, northern Italy. And then the other one did it between Gibraltar and South Africa. And at this point, I want to ask our attendees, do you think these vessels pose the same risk according to your current process? And while you're answering this, I'm going to also ask our own expert, Chloe, to share her thoughts.
Thanks, Dror. So yeah, I mean, I think if two vessels have gone dark for 2 months, I would say they both pose a risk. They've been dark for a significant amount of time, and really within that time, they can do pretty much anything in 2 months, anything in the world. You know, in an ideal world in a CDD team, I think you would not want to touch any vessel really that poses any risk. However, unfortunately, that's not always possible in reality. They may be the only vessels, you know, as options for the business, and any insights that can help make that decision and get you comfortable with using that vessel really would help.
Right. So at first sight, it would be a bit problematic given the long duration of the dark activity to know where these vessels actually went. And I think that as Chloe mentioned, it's really hard to understand the risk without understanding the context. So let's see what our attendees actually also answered. Okay, so we see that it's pretty divided between yes and no. And I think that that is the same problem that we saw in the first question that was asked to begin with, right? I mean, how do you know the entire story without getting all the details, right? I mean, we see here something that on a universal level, yes, dark activity is risky, no matter where it happens for a long duration like this. I mean, physically speaking, these vessels could have traveled to nearly anywhere in the world. And again, does that pose risk according to your risk appetite? Well, that really depends on context. And in this case, context is everything. So as you can see here, these are the two vessels that we had just asked you about. And the vessel on the left, which is the Dumani, is actually a vessel that was sanctioned or is under sanctions right now for the activity you just saw, compared to the vessel that you see on the right, which was the other one, which actually had nothing to do with sanction evasions. Now, how can we know something like that? And that is what we're going to talk about today. How do we implement reverse engineering to understand the context and then be able to provide the right insight, even when the vessels look pretty similar in size, in class, and even in the duration of the activity that they actually conducted. So this vessel was actually part of a fleet of vessels that was mentioned in the news back in January. It was sanctioned due to the activity that you saw right now, but also connected to a company called the Fittest Shipping Management based off the Ukraine. As you can see, it was published that this company had traded with the national oil company of Venezuela, PDVSA, and it involved a fleet of 4 tankers. Now, those four tankers that you can see here are, first of all, you can see something very in common just from a first glance, right? And that is that the duration of the dark activities that they're conducted, represented on the screen here by the yellow triangles, actually is very long, right? These vessels have conducted very long periods of dark activity. And when a vessel of 300 meters disappears off the radar, I mean, there are questions to be asked, right? I think that is, as Chloe mentioned before, first and foremost, risk, right? The question is, how much of a risk is it, right? And I think that the common denominators led us to ask those questions to understand more about the population. And I want to take you through the journey of the reverse engineering we actually did. So the first thing that we checked was for additional vessels doing the same thing, right? So out of 3,811 active crude oil tankers in the world, only 223 conducted dark activities for longer than 20 days over the past year. Now, I think that the first thing that we can say about those 223 vessels is that they all pose some sort of risk, okay? Vessel going dark for such a long period of time, more than 20 days, is already something worth mentioning and is noteworthy. And I think that is the first thing that we want to understand. Now, you can see in the map that is on the screen right now that the clustering of where these activities took place, started, is pretty worldwide, right? And the question is, again, how can we pour in more context to actually understand which of these 223 cases is relevant to our risk appetite and to sanctions evasions in general? Now, what we do is we feed the artificial intelligence algorithms with context, right? So we went back to the Fittest Shipping Management fleet, and we actually tried to define what other common denominators are there, right? So we have, for example, the duration of the dark activity. We have the geography of where these vessels started that activity, and that is actually very crucial because it is very different to start a dark activity within a port than it is after the last regulatory checkpoint was, for example, the Gibraltar Strait before entering international waters in the Atlantic, right? And also the usage of flag. Now, you remember I mentioned before that the Cameroon flag was systematically being abused over the past 2 years. All these vessels, the 4 vessels mentioned in the article that were sanctioned under the management of the Fittest company, were actually changing their flags to Cameroon just before they did that long period of dark activity. Now, out of the cases that we examined, we see more and more flags that actually are very, I would say, commonly used for sanctions evasions in the past year. Now, what's interesting to understand is that most of these flags are unaware they are being used. Just for reference, the last time we checked in 2020, there were 95 vessels registered with a Cameroon flag. That means officially registered. Now, compared to that, there were actually 384 vessels transmitting the flag of Cameroon. Now, that is almost 3 times the amount. And when we're talking about the abuse of a flag, is exactly that gap between what is being actually officially registered with and what is being transmitted. Now, using this entire context and using artificial intelligence algorithms, we were able to detect more than 60 new cases of vessels that we can say with a very great deal of certainty pose risk of having gone to Venezuela and conducted during that long period of dark activity. I see there are questions coming in. I just want to encourage every one of our participants to use the Q&A feature, which we will have time for later on. And at this point, I just want to go through a few examples of the typology before we move on and show you some of the things that we found. I think you'll find very interesting. Okay, great. So the first case that I want to show you, and I'm going to run through these pretty quickly, is that it's not only about where this took place, but also what happened prior to the event, right? So you can see on the bottom right-hand side of the screen, you can see the historical path of the vessel, and you can see how after changing its flag, this vessel deviates for the first time. What do I mean by deviation? This is actually the first time that this crude oil tanker sails across the Indian Ocean, right? And when reaching South Africa, we can see that it crosses the last point, I would say, that is a regulatory checkpoint, which is the Cape of Good Hope. And suddenly the vessel goes dark for a period of 56 days. Now, as you can see, the turn on transmission point is exactly, I would say, just a distance of 130 nautical miles away from where it turned off, resulting in this endless journey that you see on the left-hand side. Now, this is very interesting because if a vessel was to lose transmission because there were a lot of vessels competing for a spot in the satellite or something of the sort, we wouldn't see that correlation between the start point and the end point that is so near. And I think that is something that is very interesting to see the anomaly of the journey as well as the journey being aimless. The second one that I want to show you is that proof of that exactly regulatory checkpoint that I mentioned before. You can see the two instances of the same vessel that we suspect has gone to Venezuela. You can see the identity change once again prior to these two voyages, and then the turn-off transmission event taking place in offshore South Africa for 52 days, and another event that is actually ongoing right now, that started in the Gibraltar Strait. So again, the context is key in this case to point those vessels out. Great. And then the last thing that I wanted to say is one of the things that we find the most complicated in, I would say it's a problem for the shipping industry in general and anyone that is looking at sanctions evasions, is how do you continue conducting business as usual while identifying risk, right? Because it's not just enough to say a dark activity offshore South Africa for a long period of time. It's more about looking into which of these vessels is actually doing something, had maybe a malfunction in the AIS device, maybe had a reason for the AIS turnoff. And I think that this is super important because we are in the business of facilitating business. And I think that in this case, you can see here on the screen a vessel that at a first glance, anyone would say, yes, this completely goes hand in hand with the typology we just showed, and this vessel is probably in Venezuela, and it did a dark activity of a month. That's enough time to go back and forth. But is it? We took more and more indicators into account, for example, the average speed of the vessel, to actually be able to disqualify this case for the speed not being feasible for the vessel to go to Venezuela, load the sanctioned crude, and actually get back in time to a period where it turned back on. So I think that this is very important also in any process that we do, and we do that for the GPS manipulation typology, and we do that for identity tampering, and we do that for any typology that we investigate. And that is not only to be able to flag out those vessels that you definitely want to be aware of, but also be able to facilitate business for those vessels that might had a mistake, might had a malfunction, might had something that doesn't disqualify them from being chartered or being used. And I think that this is the most important part, being able to facilitate business. Ron, back to you.
Great, thanks, Dror, and thanks, Chloe. I think what I really heard is, which I thought was very powerful, is about the illusion of knowledge. I think out of everything, the research that you showed and, the approach, that's the part that really resonates for me. But I'd be really interested in what resonates for everybody else on the call. So there's 104 of you. So I'm sure you've all got lots of opinions and I'd love to hear them. So I'd just remind you on the Q&A, if you've got any comments or questions, please ping them in there. So I think basically we're looking at this as an emerging situation, and we think about it in terms of what, so what, and now what. The what is pretty clear, Dror laid that out. So I think we know that, deceptive shipping practices are not as clear cut, even with AI and machine learning and the deep learning models that we've been building for years. It's constantly evolving, and it needs another level of AI to make it make sense and to reveal these new patterns. But I think the so what is the fact that not tracking these new typologies means that there's a risk that needs to be mitigated. We've just shown a sample of the largest vessels with the highest value cargoes, but this needs to be done across the whole portfolio before you're exposed, whether that's financing or chartering a vessel or CDD or whatever it is. So just to kind of close out, and then we can jump to questions. Where do we go from here? I think the now what is the difficult part, because we understand the technology, we understand the processes. We've spoken to customers right across the piece, from ship owners to law firms to energy companies and banks and freight forwarders, and quite a myriad of opinions, but everybody's in the same boat, right? We're all trying to figure out how to stay ahead of bad actors. So, Chloe, from your point of view, where do we go from here? What's next?
Apologies, that's on me. So, I think really I
think you froze there. So Chloe's internet seems to have frozen. So why don't we jump to you, Dror, and then we'll come back to Chloe when the internet clears up there.
Chloe, we can hear you now.
Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there.
No worries. Carry on.
I will just repeat myself if.
Thank you.
Just in case whatever you missed. So yeah, my thoughts on the risk for the CDD teams is, they need to have the right tools in place so they can see all of these insights. So all the insights that we mentioned earlier, and also being responsive to changes in those. So the ever evolving, requirements and changing. Also, the bad guys are getting better at what they do. So being able to stay on top of that, as Dror has mentioned, all of these changes and context. So when you are reviewing these insights, having context in order to sift through the information, whether that can help with, removing the noise, or looking at which of these behaviors and these events are actually higher risk, and being able to see that. And with this, it brings efficiency to the processes. So being able for CDD teams to make quick decisions from a robust framework. And obviously the nature of the shipping industry and turnaround times, it's extremely fast. So, having the efficiency there really helps the team, the CDD team, as well as the business.
Great. Thanks, Chloe. And Dror, what next? Where do we go? What do people need to do?
I think that is a complex question. I think that regulators have decided where people need to go, and I think that they're just touching really the tip of the iceberg, because the more the regulators will demand in terms of what to look at, the more deceptive shipping practices will evolve. This is a cat and mouse game, and I think that everyone's doing a really good job, both the ones chasing and the ones running away. And I think some of the questions also refer to that, and we'll get to that in a second. But I think that the most important thing right now is to be able to get the most clear-cut insights about things that are sometimes more complicated than what meets the eye, right? So I think that the OFAC advisory did a good job at raising the flag, but not that much of a good job in defining what are exactly the typologies, right? So for example, and we discussed this in a previous webinar, that flag hopping is a very vague definition of a very specific problem, right? And that is the usage of flags, right? But what is flag hopping? How fast is the duration in which flag registries need to be changed to be able to define that as flag hopping? Same with, dark activity. How long of a dark activity is Can you hear me now?
Yeah. So we just lost a couple of words there, but I think how long a dark activity is, and then.
Oh, how long a dark activity is deemed problematic, right? I mean, we just saw dark activities of 2 whole months. Is that more risky than a dark activity of 7 days? Well, it really depends on the context, right? So again, defining the problem is one step, and then being able to give an answer to that is a whole different thing. And I think that is where we come in, or where I think there are tools out there. There are enablers, right?
Yeah.
That you got covered under what the regulators are demanding, and not only that, but also beyond. We're always looking for the next deceptive shipping practice. We're also always looking out for what is changing in the maritime domain and how vessels are behaving. And I think that preemptively, you could be ready for the next advisory before it actually comes out.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, because the conversations we've had lately, where we've circled back with people that we spoke to 2 years ago, it's exactly about that, right? Is there a problem? Is it an emerging problem? How big a deal is it? And then four advisories came after that. But exactly what you're saying about, how do you make sure that you're set up as a company, as a team, within your risk envelope, to be able to manage and mitigate that kind of risk before it becomes an issue. So it's like that 35-page document you laid out earlier with the May 2020 advisory. Actually, we already had all of that, and it's kind of interesting to see if you're always trying to see what happens next, then you're pretty well covered to. It's already there. You basically got to keep your eye on what's emerging, pretty much like what we shared today. So hopefully, we've given you some new insights on what we think is a clearly a dynamic situation. I mean, we've been briefing on this for a few years now. I guess in closing, what I'd say is if you haven't reviewed how you approach your own company CDD processes or chartering processes or vetting or whatever in the last 2 years, we'd recommend that this is a good time to review your exposure, because we think that things like vertical AI, for example, which I mentioned earlier on, is the key to staying ahead in this kind of constantly emerging threat. So with that, why don't we jump into our Q&A and then see where we go from there. So let me just pull up the questions. So I've got one here, which I'll put to you, Dror. So what's the difference between these dark activities and the ones you mentioned started, hang on, so what does it say? Started in 2016 when discussing the deceptive shipping practices overview?
So I think that's a great question. Dark activity has been around for a while now. And I think that most recently, we've seen actually a wave of vessels that are transmitting more often than before. I think dark activity was a very common use practice in the past, but then, there's a big liability for the vessel itself going dark. I mean, insurance claim wise and safety, of course. And I think that now what we're seeing is that dark activity is mostly used for in a specific, I would say, frame, right? It means that it's not longer going dark just because, and that was being used a lot in the past, especially for governmental risk, security risk. And now we're seeing dark activity being used for very long periods of time, right? So in 2016, to find a vessel that did 2 months of dark activity would be a vessel that has an AIS property. That would be most of the cases you'll see. And now suddenly you see that this is so systematic that not only is it the same type amount of duration, it's also actually starting and ending in the same location. So suddenly I would say it's like dark activity has become orchestrated. And in the past, it was like something much more random taking place in different parts of the world.
Yeah, interesting. And here's another one. What about, what's the relation between vessels turning off their transmission and those manipulating GPS?
So I think that's the choice that each, I would say, illicit actor has to take, right? Am I going off the grid, or am I staying on the grid but showing you a different location, right? Yeah. And I think those are the two prominent typologies that we are seeing in 2021. If you want to avoid sanctions in modern days, you have one of two choices. You either go, I would say, more technologically advanced to try to manipulate the location that is being transmitted, or that you just disappear off the grid for a long period of time, try to confuse or throw off whoever's looking in terms of where could I be, right? As we saw in the first slide, in which we compared the two vessels, when you go dark for 2 months, it can be anywhere, right? So to relate that behavior to a specific sanction regime, for example, is much more problematic. So I think that is the strongest connection right now. It's one or the other.
Sure. Okay. And then here's one. Maybe I'll start this one with you, Chloe, and then Dror, you can comment. But how is a CDD team, so a customer due diligence team, supposed to keep up with this evolving change or these changes?
Very good question. It's extremely challenging. And I think, having the right tools in place really helps teams. I mean, it's not only the CDD team when it comes to transactions, especially in energy companies. You're not just looking at CDD, you've got to manage vetting and credit, and there's so many different elements in a transaction, really short turnaround times. And there's constant changes. I mean, in the last 10 years being in energy and shipping, I've seen such a change in requirements, and obviously, a lot in the last 3 years with the advisories, and having a tool that can help you adapt to those very quickly does help, rather than obviously setting up project teams that maybe take a year to then embed these, kind of implement these new risks. So I mean, that's something, if you can get like the ideal tool in one, I mean, that would be heaven for me as a ex-CDD team member.
Sure. Okay, thanks, Chloe. And we've got a few questions here. So one is about if a ship goes dark for a few hours, not days, the concern is about ship-to-ship transfers during those hours. So, and the example in this question is sorry, it's a long question. In the Arabian Gulf, many innocent vessels will sail close to Iran. It's a regular path for commercial vessels to do. So, so what do we do? How do we deal with that? So, I think Dror, you're going to answer that one, right?
Yeah. So we have ship to ship has been around always, and I think that realizing what is two vessels sailing in the vicinity of one another and what is a ship to ship transfer is one of the biggest challenges for anyone doing tracking in maritime domain. And I think that we've invested so much in building a deep learning model that is actually has a amazing precision in detecting these. And I think that it gets more complicated once vessels are actually doing what we call semi-dark ship-to-ship, right? Which is when one vessel is transmitting and the other isn't. And I think that we've also gone a long way into being able to see those, define those as a risk building block, whether it be the vessel that disappeared or the vessel that was actually loitering in place waiting for the other one to arrive, right? That with a combination of additional data points such as satellite imagery or so on can give you the full image of whether that behavior is posing as risk or not. But definitely to whoever asked the question, this is a very crucial building block that we are completely addressing.
Sure. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Dror. And who's that? Who's saying Amjad? There's a question about, is there a recorded link? Yes, there is, and we'll share that with you after this, so you'll be able to watch it over and over again. Okay. What else have we got?
So there's a great question here. Have you seen the age of tankers acting as a behavior parameter for these dark activities? For example, is flag hopping more common across all tankers? From Armin Azizian. So first of all, that is an amazing question. And we actually have something written coming out in the next couple of weeks that does a full-on comparison between the old tanker population and the new tanker population. And you'll see that the differences are mesmerizing. So you'll see things anywhere from the usage of certain flags to behavior, and you'll see that age of tankers is definitely a very strong indicator. And I think that is also age is already being taken into account. Chloe, correct me if I'm wrong, in due diligence processes. And also that applies not only to commercial risk or sanction evasions risk. We see that vessels more prone to drug trafficking or human trafficking or any type of commodity trafficking are usually the older vessels. So yes, to answer your questions, that is a very strong parameter.
Sure. Thanks, Dror. Okay, guys, looking at the rest of the questions, anything that jumps out?
Yeah, sure. There's a question here by Lee. You mentioned that the use of military level technology to counter risk management controls, given the sanctions are typically part of foreign policy and reflect threats to national interests. Do you believe that we now need real-time military level intelligence and disclosure to provide to private firms from the government? So I think that that is a bit, it's a bit a stretch, I would say, to real-time military level intelligence. I don't think that's still needed in the commercial market. But I think that the tools that are being offered nowadays are not far from it already, right? It's not about what real-time intelligence can give you, it's about the insights that you can get in real time, right? And I think that what we try to do is to analyze military level intelligence to give commercial insights as well, and not only the old school static, I would say, assessment of vessels.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, what else do we have here? So it's interesting. So there's a question here from Sandro about, do the international authorities investigate these behaviors to sanction and disqualify or sanction these vessels, or they don't care? So I think what's interesting about that question is, if you asked that question 18 months ago, then the concept of behavior wasn't really prevalent. Whether the regulators realized it or not, essentially what they asked for last year was probably 8 things that people are expected to do, 3 of which were pretty much handled already by traditional systems, list matching systems that we talked about right at the start. So static approach. There's 5 other things at least that they asked for, which were absolutely about behavior. And in order to do that, it isn't enough to just say, was something dark for X, Y, Z amount of time. It's, when I say behavior, I'm talking about that, think about it like scaffolding. You've got to build some solid foundations, and then you've got to build the story from that. We think about that like building blocks of risk. So I guess what they asked for really, in essence, was could only be answered with behavior. So that's quite a unique approach. But luckily we were already, that's basically how we operate. So it made it quite straightforward for us. But yeah, it's a great question. Okay, what else have we got?
We have a great question here about how much of an AIS gap is red flag. And again, as we mentioned before, context is key. I mean, if you see a vessel doing dark activity for less than a day, but it's offshore the coast of Cyprus, could it pose a risk of the vessel going into Syria? Definitely. But what happens when a vessel turns off its AIS off the coast of South Africa? How long does it need to be actually pose a risk in terms of Venezuela, for example? So I think that what we try to do is to formulate the context for you, right? And to say, both of them are dark activities and both of them pose risk, but we can associate the risk to a regime. That is one. And that is also very important according to your risk appetite. And the second is we can also take out the false positives, right? The ones that are not posing any risk, even though they would seem to be enough. And we can do that by calculating the average speed and the nearest, I would say, risk zone or something of the sort. So how much of an AIS gap is a red flag? It depends on where it is. I think that's the most important thing. Context is key.
Yeah, great. And there's a question here about what about OFAC sanctioned vessels that change the operational area to EU? Do you consider this operational change as risky per se? I mean, that's quite a complex, there's lots of layers to that question. It's 2 sentences long, but it's actually quite a big subject. But what we look at is things like who has a nexus to the USA, for example. If we were thinking about OFAC, there's obviously other regimes that we're looking at. But if we think about OFAC, is the trade in dollars? What's the ownership structure? What's the management structure? What's the ultimate beneficial owner? We're looking at it as a holistic thing, and the idea is that it's dynamic. So when they change operational areas, that's the kind of thing that our system is looking for all the time. I don't know if that answered your question, but I hope it gave you a bit of color. Okay, what else have we got? And there's another question here from a shipping insurance company, which is a big chunk of our business, actually. And the question you ask is a great one, because you're saying we're often stuck in a difficult position, on one hand managing our relationship and engagement with ship owners on their explanation, and on the other hand keeping in mind the banking risk appetite, who are also our customers. Machine algorithms paint a picture to a certain extent, but it doesn't always return conclusive evidence of illicit activity. It's just a hypothesis of what actually happened, or potentially happened. Potentially, I should say, not actually. So I'll start, maybe Dror, you jump in, or Chloe. So from my point of view, and we work with most of the P&I clubs, for example, it's a similar position. So one of the things we're trying to do is present an objective view of a collection of multi-layers of data, which have been, through our AI platform. And in the end, what we're trying to do is help an outcome, an objective outcome with a go, no go decision, for example, or an indication of, with everything that we've put together, what's the most likely outcome. So what we're trying to do is basically augment what, in this case, the shipping insurance guy would be looking at, because they're trying to build a story, right? So what we're trying to do is fill in the gaps in the most concise way possible with the most accurate data possible. Dror, would you add anything to that? Or
I think that was great. I mean, we are a decision support tool. I think that every model also has misses, and that's okay. We understand that the world is not just black and white. It's not just that easy to decide. And I can also relate to what is being asked here, because it's a problem. It's difficult, right? We definitely the question says machine learning algorithms paint a picture to a certain extent, but it's not always return conclusive evidence of illicit activities. That is correct. I mean, to say a vessel was somewhere with 100%, you need someone on the ground taking a picture of the vessel doing whatever it is that it's doing, and you can't always get that. But I think that to conduct business on a bigger scale, you just need that recommendation and that augmentation of something that you might not be able to do on yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you give 1 minute? This is a slightly different thing, not necessarily, it's on topic, but I think it's about, when you think about how we've built what we've built and the way we think about what we build, there's a great question here. Do you also have voyage anomalies or any kind of anomaly detection for voyages? And one thing, can you just give us 1 minute on, use the breath as an example? I know it's about drugs, but I think it's a cool way of thinking about, how do you think about the collection and collation of data in a new and interesting way to come out with an amazing outcome?
Definitely. I think that you mentioned the breath. It's a vessel we used many times for demos, because I think that the most interesting part of it was that everything that the vessel did prior to its apprehension for drug trafficking was actually a deviation from its regular pattern of life. And I think that we've been seeing that in sanction evasions over time, increasing like crazy, right? So there are just simple indicators that you can follow to know that a vessel is cooking something up, right? And what I mean the vessel is, of course, the financial entity behind that vessel that is telling the vessel where to go and which cargo to actually load. But voyage anomalies is much the bread and butter of what Windward has been doing since its beginning. And that is to be able to notice what vessels do regularly, and then be able to flag the anomalies. And the way that we do that is we gather, and this is our pyramid, right? We gather just great amounts of data, and then we build profiles, operational profiles for different classes of vessels according to the area of operation. And once you have those operational profiles, I think that for each comparable category, it's pretty easy to understand what is different. And once you understand what is different, you put it into context like we did today, and then you understand if it's risky or not. I mean, not every anomaly is risky, but every anomaly is worth mentioning. And I think that in the terms of sanctions, it's even easier, right? Sanction evasions, it's easier to flag what is risk and what isn't, because there are clear guidelines as to what you can and can't do.
Yeah.
I think that that's the way we operate since the beginning.
Nice. You didn't mention the outcome. Can you just mention the outcome?
The outcome of
breath.
The breath. So the vessel was actually caught with a ton of cocaine on board by, I think it was the Spanish customs. And what was interesting to see was that the risk level of the vessel that was calculated by our AI algorithm actually was just going on the rise according to every step of the way. So when the vessel changed its identity, when the vessel deviated from its regular pattern of operation, first time in different locations, and then eventually the apprehension itself. Excellent.
Nice one. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. And I think this kind of points to something. Sorry, my screen just moved. Hang on. Can you please show again how they manipulate GPS in the Arab Gulf? We don't have time to actually go and show it to you, but one thing I wanted to just touch on is, as I think you're alluding to, there's lots of complication when you've got there's 90 ports in the Middle East, let's say, that we think about. So when we think about those 90 ports and those multiple jurisdictions, and we think about the EEZ and the territorial waters, et cetera, et cetera. So do you want to just comment on that briefly, Dror, in terms of how we think about EEZ and what difference that makes and how we might apply that in different situations?
Sure. So I think that also there was he was referring also to that symmetrical circle that we saw earlier on in the Gulf there. That was super interesting. I think that the Gulf is kind of like the petri dish of these deceptive shipping practices. And that's what we've been seeing in the past few months. I mean, everything is becoming much more global. The digitalization of the shipping industry is causing that, something that we see in a UN panel of experts report in North Korea find its way to Venezuela a year after, and now it's even less than years. It's in months. It's in even days. You see a typology starting somewhere, and then it ends up getting somewhere else. So I think that geography has no longer become a factor in terms of where you see something more than in others. And I think that in terms of the geography in the Arab Gulf, definitely, as you mentioned, Ron, we're looking at a variety of ports that is in the area, and a huge amount of vessels traveling through the Hormuz Straits every day, making it even much more harder to be able to track. And I think that is where our coverage comes into play. And
right.
I think that the fact that we have both satellite and terrestrial coverage to cover those areas is making our life much easier in being able to detect what is just noise and what is a problem because of just congestion of vessels, and what is actually the behavior of the vessel or the manipulation being implemented.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Dror. I think we've run out of time, so I want to make sure that you're all able to get to your next Zoom call. I'm sure you're excited about that. So thanks very much for joining us. Thanks to Chloe, thanks to Dror for all the research, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again soon. Anybody got any follow-up questions or things that we didn't cover? I think we covered quite a few of the questions, but if there's anything we didn't cover or there's something that you want to follow up on with any of us, please email me. That's my direct email address. And then I'll work with the team and we'll come right back to you. So have a great day. We'll see you at another Windward webinar soon. Thank you.